strike rate's very, very overrated.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strike Rate, the cricket analytics podcast with me, Jack Hope, and Dan Weston. On this episode of the pod, we're going to be talking about impact subs, and we're going to be answering the question, what is the impact of the impact sub? So we went county cricket on you last week. We're going back to the IPL now. Dan, we just saw a really nuts game, and this might be a good starting point as an entry into this conversation. So before I even do any of the intro stuff for this, we just saw, what was it? The best part of 550 runs, RCB taking on Sunrisers Hyderabad. It goes later than it probably should have done, thanks to Dinesh Karthik going ballistic. We had Travis Head going nuts earlier in the game. And it's not the first time this season where we've seen crazy things happening in the IPL. Impact sub, new rule last year. Do you want to give us an idea, or do you want to start straight away by diving in and talking about whether there's a connection between those two things?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's a lot of things to unpack here in this discussion about impact subs, and I think that we're going to get on with that over the next 40 minutes or so. But essentially, an impact sub gives teams the ability to, if they're batting first at least, to extend their lineup and then take a batter off at half time and bring a bowler on. And that's generally the template so far. Personally, I would prefer to see the impact sub be used in a context where you have to name your teams before the toss. So that way, then you don't get to captain by template. Basically, there's a lot more jeopardy involved and a lot more sort of scrutiny on decision making, which I think would be really fun. And as it happens, I mean, we've seen this happening in the Big Bash in terms of additional rules. When additional rules come in, be it the power surge or the bash boost point or whatever it is, it takes teams a while to adapt to it as well and to work out the optimal usage or close to optimal usage for the strategy. And then also, just to give another major point for the impact sub as well, is that it gives a safety net more for other batters. So I think it's a mistake to quantify the impact of the impact sub solely on the performance of the impact sub. It actually has an impact on the rest of the team as well, because it frees them up to play more attacking.
Right, I think that's a good entree. So now I'll do the introduction stuff. You should make sure you like and subscribe to Strike Rate, the Cricket Analytics podcast, wherever you're watching or listening. And make sure you follow me and Dan on Twitter as well. Dan is at SA Advantage and I'm at Jack Hope 0. We do shout outs for questions before most of the episodes that we do. And we want our audience to get involved. And we actually had loads of really good questions today, which made my job easier when it came to planning this. So we're going to have a little discussion up front about some data that we've been looking at. And then we've got about 8 or 9 really, really insightful questions from our audience. And we'll be getting to that in part 2. We should probably start, though, Dan, right at the beginning, because there might be some people out there listening who aren't huge IPL fans, don't follow it that closely, don't really understand how the impact sub works. I know I was on Guerrilla Cricket recently, for example, and some of the guys who do that, who are big cricket heads, didn't get how the dynamic was different to the super sub that used to be in ODI cricket. And we had a lot of on-air discussions about, how teams are using it and why it's become quite formulaic, and a little bit about the impact. But if I can just ask you for a really simple intro to it, what is the impact sub in the IPL? How is it a little bit different to other subs we've seen in cricket? And, good. Let's start there. Let's start simple with a couple of easy questions.
Okay, so basically at the moment in most formats of cricket and in most leagues, you can only have a direct sub. And when I say direct sub, I mean can bat, can bowl. It's not a sub fielder. The only times you can really usually have that in other formats or in other leagues is when there's a case of concussion. And even then, the guidelines are quite specific. So let's say, for sake of argument, you're 30 for 4 and your batter has just got a bouncer in the head and it has to come off. you've got to replace him with a like for like player, if that makes sense. So you can't say, okay, well, it's probably a really bad example, say 30 for 4, but let's say they're 200 for 4 in an ODI or something like that, and a batter gets hit in the head, and you've got batting down to number 9. You might think, oh, it's a great opportunity for me to sub on a fast bowler or a spinner or something like that, because we've got good runs, we've got good depth already. But you can't do that. You have to have like really specific skill set to be able to use a concussion sub who can bat and bowl. But this is literally more of a a lot more freedom in that you can pick one of 5. You can name your team after the toss, so you know if you're going to be batting first or bowling first. Most teams who bat first tend to pick the extra batter and then sub one of them off for a bowler at half time, which again, I think we've already kind of mentioned is quite templated and formulaic in that usage. Sometimes you might get a team batting first who's struggling, and they might bring on a batter if they really need the depth. I know Delhi did that early on. I think with Abhishek Paral in one game. I think it was against PBKs. It has happened a couple of other times as well. So there are other examples, but basically it gives the team a bit more flexibility to use additional resources which they wouldn't have previously had prior to the introduction of the impact rule ahead of the 2023 IPL season.
Yeah. So that gives us an overview of what it is. You've said that most teams, what they're doing is they're swapping a specialist bowler for a specialist batter, or vice versa, depending on whether they bat or bowl first. Which, let's do the strategic angle first before we do what impact it's had, which is probably the right thing to do. I think we'd probably agree on that. I think when the initial rule came in, there were some ideas that you could have like a varied bench and there'd be lots of interesting tactical nuance. But the way it's actually played out with the naming of the team slightly later means that most teams are roughly doing the right thing. Would you say so far?
Yeah, because it's so formulaic. You know, like, and this is, I think you make a really key point there in terms of like it's brought in not to be formulaic. I don't think the purpose of it necessarily was to be formulaic. I think was brought in probably to add a tactical dimension and extra decision making kind of talking points, I suppose, for the league, and that hasn't really happened because of the formulaic nature of the rules so far, and how teams have basically just kind of diverted to this, maybe 90% of the time they're doing a standard kind of thing. I think personally, my adaptation would be to name the team before the toss, and then there are all sorts of possibilities there from then in terms of how you might use that impact sub.
Right, so let's talk about what impact it's had, and we'll start bigger picture here.
Yeah.
What has happened in the IPL over the last 4 years, which gives us some data before and after the introduction of the impact sub? Like, how have things changed?
Okay, so in a big way, in terms of attacking intent, it is absolutely the IPL in terms of boundary percentage, 6% strike rate across all phases has really undergone a dramatic transformation. I'm not saying that that's only due to the impact sub, because I think that it's very difficult to isolate the variable enough to say that it's solely due to the impact sub, because I do think that the expansion to 10 teams has also had an impact in that, because now there are worse bowlers bowling against really good batters, basically. Like, so the top batters are still really good, but they're now facing worse bowlers more often because of the fact that the quality is now more diluted with 10 teams as opposed to 8. So I think both of those factors are really key in combining to create this high intent, high attacking dynamic. So just to give listeners some context, in 2021, the boundary percentage was just over 16% in the whole season in the IPL. Just in 2022, it was around 18%. And then since the expansion and the impact sub in 2023 and 2024 is now between 19 and 20% boundaries. So we saw the expansion to 10 teams in 2022. It upped it, the boundary percentage, and then it's also gone further now that there's the impact sub. And the data for this year, 19.86% boundaries, doesn't include the Sunrise
the game from today.
So it's probably well over 20% now, So yeah, and that ratio of 4s to 6s has also increased. So for example, in 2021, you were looking at about 11 4s a game. Now it's 12, just under 13. But the 6s have gone up about 2.5% in that time period as well. So the 6s are slightly outgrowing 4s as well. So we're seeing batters go more aerial and have that higher aerial intent, looking for the extra reward for 6 hitting. And I genuinely do believe that the understanding and the value of boundary hitting is cricket's equivalent of the 3-point moment in basketball, where actually now you might not be so successful in every shot that you make, but the reward is worth more, making it a more valuable proposition than other options. But interestingly enough, that boundary percentage is completely translated into an increase in strike rate. So, for example, the strike rate in the IPL this season is around 20 runs per 100 balls more than it was in 2021, and about 15 more than in 2022. And that's because the boundaries and the 6s have increased. So there's a direct relationship all of the time between boundary percentage and strike rate. And we're seeing that again here. But funny enough, the balls per dismissal hasn't changed really. It's always hovering around the high 18s to high 19s balls per dismissal across 4 seasons of IPL from 2021 to 2024. So what can we say here? Again, maybe that's the impact of the worst bowlers now bowling against better batters as well. So again, we're seeing that actually it's difficult to isolate it to be solely due to the impact sub, but it's these factors are combining to make the environment, I think, a lot more batter friendly than it has been in at any stage of it in any league. Really, I think it's pretty fair to say. And Jack, I think you tweeted during the game that the only team that have conceded more than 287 in a T20 match was Mongolia. Okay,
that is true. Yeah,
and I think that's a complete, complete case in point, really, about how in the IPL this year with the impact sub, we're just seeing batters dominate right now, and we might have to start reframing the benchmarks for bowlers and actually realizing that actually if you're going for your pacer and you're going for 9s in a match, it's probably not that bad. It's probably actually okay. And what's good is now is not what was good in 2015, for example. Like 10 or so years ago. The things have completely changed, and we're also seeing all of the higher levels of intent translate from phase to phase. So we're seeing this in the power play. We're seeing it at the death, and to a slighter extent, but still very notable in the middle overs too. The death strike rate this season in the IPL is not far off 30 runs per 100 balls higher than in 2021, which is insane. I mean, that's so big. And what we're also seeing is a slight edge towards teams batting first, or maybe not slight edge towards them, but the balance has shifted in terms of actually now it's not a chasers league. We're starting to see that teams batting first are able to pace their innings a little bit better with the safety net of the impact player. And they know they can go that bit harder, whereas previously they're like, I don't know if I can twist here because our batting stops at number 7, and we're going to be in big trouble if we go 5 down after 14 overs or something like that. And now they're thinking, just keep going because we've got if we're struggling, just bring in an impact side. It's fine. So I think we're avoiding those sort of turgid phases of matches where a team's 30 for 3 and then they just knock it around for 5 overs and stuff like that. I think that has a balancing effect on batting first or batting second. But I also think that it's fair to say that because of the avoidance of those boring phases of play which tended to happen before, we're seeing a more marketable product as well in the IPL, and more exciting thing for the casual fan, I think, who loves seeing sixes smacked into the stands rather than nurdling it round for singles.
I think a lot of that is true. I mean, from a personal point of view, I'm not a huge fan of the rule. And we'll get to that in some of the questions that we'll come to later. But that's a taste question. It's not really an analytical question. And if you want questions about what I think about stuff and me talking about that, then you should probably go to the other podcast, the cricket podcast, where we chat loads of nonsense, and very little of it is verifiable. On that, though, actually, I just want to give a shout out to Ross from the cricket podcast, who predicted yesterday that Sunrisers Hyderabad were going to break the record for most runs scored ever in an IPL innings if they batted first against RCB. He just saw it coming. And even though RCB are bad and Sunrisers Hyderabad are quite good, that's still a pretty big call to be like, yeah, more than 277 and go public with it. So well done for that one, Ross. Dan, one of the things I wanted to pick up actually, I was on the phases. It's interesting that you highlighted the death strike rate, and I actually thought that the most notable impact was earlier in the game, and this relates to the kind of psychological points that you were making. I wonder with the 21 data whether there's a little bit of UAE influence in what's going on there, and also you've got the concentrated talent of only 8 teams and lots of teams with competent death bowling. So I think when I was looking at the data, I was looking at the 22 season and then the 23 and what we've had in the 24 season. And I thought the 9-run leap in strike rate in the middle overs and the 20-run leap in strike rate between 22 and 24 in the power play were the two things that really stood out to me, because what that told me was that the players earlier in the innings who previously were in foundation setting mode, and this is even after the 10-team IPL and the expansion and some more bad players, or more or less good players, let's say, because everyone's pretty good in the IPL, come into the league. We still saw lots of platform builders. I mean, a strike rate of 121, that would have been right at the bottom if compared across all leagues. Like, no other league was so safe in the power play as the IPL. And now it's 142, which I'd venture's, probably above average, or at least average. And I think the theory is, and you've touched on it a few times, is that this is batters being able to go hard early, knowing that they have the security down the order. I wonder, therefore, Dan, whether this is something that's somewhat devaluing the power play specialist from a bowling perspective.
It's a question I've been asked before. Look, I don't think so. Is my take on it. Primarily because actually power play wicket taking still has value, because you're more likely to get a team 5 down quicker than if you don't. Basically, if you've got mediocre power play bowlers, and that will impact later phases decision making to some degree. It might bring on a collapse, and that's fine too. I know where you're going with that, but I think it's a bit too straightforward to think that negates the impact of it. And actually, the best way to stem run scoring is to take wickets, and I think that there's still an impact for power play bowlers. Although, I know what you mean though. I'd probably say that there's still massive scope for them, but not as much as death specialists, which now are becoming really, really hard to find in the marketplace. And you're looking at players now who in the IPL who you would say, banker death bowlers. You could probably, only really name about 5. When I say banker, I mean absolute locks to maybe 9 times out of 10 not go for double boundaries in an over or something like that, or double digits. And that's really rare, and I think that we're seeing that scarcity of resources move further on to the death, whereas there's still plenty of what I would call red ball bowlers who still bowl in the power play, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And one final thing that I wanted to ask, and we'll move on to some questions from the audience after this, was kind of question around specialisms. And I don't mean here in terms of batter, bowler, all rounder. I forgot the other thing that people do in cricket there for a moment. I mean in terms of like specialist roles that batters play, and I don't know if this is something that's come up a few times this year because of some weird games. Like we saw Tim David being dropped below PS Chawla and things like that. But one of the things I wonder whether it's happening is because we've got these impact subs coming in who are often a little bit more limited than a player that would demand a position in the 11, or it might work the other way around. A batter's getting into the 11 who is a little bit more limited than before because you're effectively naming 12 players. You might have the opportunity with the usage of some of your bowlers, and I think particularly here around spinners, to carry them until a little bit later in the innings because you can target those players. And that might be a development that's happening because we're just more analytically smart in cricket now than we were 5 years ago, or it might be something that's also driven by the super sub or the impact sub rather. And I'd be interested to get your take on whether that's something you've observed or whether you think that's just me picking up on a few trends recently.
No, I think you got some valid point for sure there in terms of actually it's producing players, or it's going to produce players as through market forces that are more flawed in some ways, but can still be really effective in the role that they're playing. So look at it from this point of view. For example, if you've got an all-rounder, for example, because this happens a lot. This is a quite commonplace trend for the skill set. You've got an all-rounder who murders pace, but is really bad against spin. Okay, and it happens a lot. Now, as an impact sub, they can come in knowing, or you can delay their entry point easier, knowing that you can put them on in the last 4 or 5 overs, and they're probably almost only going to face pace. Whereas in the past, you might have had to expose their weaknesses a lot more when you don't want to when they're in your team. So there are ways to now put players in roles which suit their super strengths a lot more and kind of conceal their weaknesses. And this is going to be so fascinating as well in terms of market valuation of players, because now it's a lot easier for players to pull the wool over teams' eyes about if they haven't done their proper research and understanding their best roles. Because you could have a player who literally always plays in a role which suits their super strengths and look really good, but actually they're not that good unless you can continue. If you say another team recruits them, you've got to keep putting them in that role in the same conditions, and it's far from a given that they'll be able to replicate that. It's like when we've seen it a few times with players and coaches in football. If you leave Brighton, you might not be as good somewhere else because Brighton know how to get the best out of you. That's a kind of a trend really we're seeing now in football, and I think that we'll see that in cricket as well a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much exactly what I was getting at. Like, you used to have a batting lineup which had 5, maybe 6 really decent batters, but they all had to be able to bat in a scenario where you were 30 for 3 because that happens. Now you have 7, and they don't all need to be able to do that. You still need a few that can, but you can carry a guy who will just get out for 3 if he ever sees a spinner. Like there's no chance of doing anything. But if he gets launched in the last 4 overs, is Andre Russell. He'll do mad things. Anyway, Dan, I think we'll take a break there, and then we'll come back and get some questions.
Strike rate's very, very overrated.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strike Rate, the Cricket Analytics podcast, where it's time for your questions. Thank you very much for sending them in, and a reminder that you can find me, Jack Hope, at JackHope0, and Dan at SA Advantage on Twitter. We'll do these call outs for questions. I don't think we got to any on the last show because we had plenty ourselves for Paul Nixon. And it was such a good podcast. If you want to go back and learn a little bit more about how coaching and analytics work together, and how how analytics works in the county game, and how coaching works in the county game as well, and how difficult being a head coach is, I'd really recommend that. I think you'd learn loads about the workings of the sport. We will, though, move on to some questions. And we'll start with Bayram Kazi, who asks, is the best usage of the impact sub a specialist for a specialist? I certainly think so. So that was Bayram saying, I certainly think so. And I think we're saying, as the rules currently stand, yes, is probably the answer to that, isn't it?
Yeah, and then with that the niche skill set of a super strength as well. So, for example, like we gave the example of a pace hitter at the death. So I know Bayram a little, and I know that he covers a lot of cricket in Pakistan. And you look at someone like Iftikhar Ahmed, for example, in PSL, who's a great hitter of pace, but against spin can struggle. And actually, maybe this, like the impact sub, or not necessarily making him the impact sub, but being able to use the impact sub to put him in positions where he can showcase his super strengths a lot more is a really good example of what that might achieve.
Yeah, and I think that, to go back to one of your original points, that's a good example of how the impact sub, the actual player who is the impact sub, is kind of irrelevant in this discourse. It's what happens to everyone else in the team and how you can use them.
Yeah, they're facilitators.
Yeah, exactly. Navneet asks, even though the quality of both bat and ball should have increased, only runs seem to have gone higher. Is that due to a lack of quality bowling? And I think that's a great question, because logically speaking, that kind of makes sense, but it isn't what we've seen at all, is it?
Well, we've seen runs increase. Obviously, we've gone through all the data for that. My suspicion, at least, is that the impact sub has some impact in it, and I said earlier, and also the weaker bowling does have some impact as well. I mean, like, you look at the spin attacks of some of the IPL teams, Mumbai, RCB in particular, and to some extent, you could probably throw that at Sunrisers as well, without Hasaranga. And, like, these spin attacks, we wouldn't see a spin attack like this before the expansion. No chance, absolutely no chance. IPL teams didn't want to recruit a spinner from overseas because they felt that there were good enough options in the domestic market. But I think we're seeing now that it's spread so thin. So, give you an example, right? Let's say, on average, 6 bowlers bowl 20 overs between them, right? In an 8-team league, you've got 48 bowlers, right, in a round of games. And now you're looking at 10 teams, there's 60 bowlers, plus potentially more with an impact sub as well. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility to say that 65, 70 bowlers are going to be bowling in a round of games, right? And like in a round of matches. And that means that the next kind of 20 odd bowlers who wouldn't have got a game before are now getting games and bowling overs and being exposed by the batters who are still really good. You've also seen, from the other side of things, now a bowler like Bumrah, for example. I think no one would disagree that he's the best bowler in the world by probably quite a distance. And he's taking like 5 for 20s and stuff like that against, maybe he's killing cheaper wickets against the worst batters as well, because that can be a thing too, because again, the dilution of quality is there. Although, on the side note, I think that the quality of the domestic batting in terms of the younger players has really blossomed in the last year or two. So there is a difference in the evolution of the player pool and the different skill sets which the domestic players can now offer. I think now you're looking at it where you're going to have to do some seriously good overseas recruitment for a bowling group to do well in the IPL now. I think it's really tough if you just go like for overseas batters, and I think teams like RCB to some degree over the years that's been their modus operandi. Have gone very batter heavy. I've seen a few teams go pick 4 overseas batters this year. The marketplace is moving. They shouldn't be doing things like that now.
Interesting that RCB picked 2 overseas bowlers today, got absolutely punished. And I'm sure it will be confirmation bias, and they'll pick some more overseas batters to help them try and chase down 280 next season as well. Prashanth says, for IPL teams that haven't used it well, in your opinion, what would you do if you were in that dugout? Are there any teams that stand out for being a bit useless with the use of the impact sub?
I don't think useless. I think because it's so templated, it's formulaic, as we've sort of discussed in part 1. I think that it's very difficult to screw up, basically, and that, I think that's a real shame, because I'd like to see an extra tactical dimension to that, in terms of like the ability. If you plan well, can you outthink the opposition? Can you get another edge in your planning? And then ultimately that leads to talking points as well during games and post match and stuff. They are, why did he do that? But at the moment you don't have that really, because it's quite formulaic. The only thing that I would say is that sometimes I think that teams make weird decisions about who to sub on or sub off with they don't really. I wouldn't say that they particularly bear expected impact contributions in mind. Like sometimes, like they might sub off a number 9 batter when actually they should be subbing off like a number 11 batter, if in that circumstance, kind of thing. Or like I don't know. There's a few things that I think that maybe, or make sure you always sub off the worst fielder, but because I don't know if teams always do that as well.
That's exactly the example I was going to point to, actually. That there are teams quite regularly who seem to not have their best fielders on the pitch, and Rinku Singh, for example, the other night for KKR. Was it the day? Yeah, he started the game. He started the game on the bench, and it was like, that's just not. Why is Venkatesh Iyer on the field when you've got Rinku Singh? Like, you're not going to bowl Venkatesh Iyer, or it's highly unlikely. Use the guys who are good at fielding. Don't leave them on the bench. And I think there's a whole other show that we'll do at some point about fielding and how there's, because we can't really measure it properly. I think it's probably a little bit undervalued, but it blows my mind how regularly you see a good fielder taken off or a good fielder left on the bench when you know that there's a bad fielder out on the field. Or another one is when a bowler completes their allocation or is not going to bowl anymore, and they don't take him off for the batter. Now you might have some scenarios where you want to pick which batter you're going to pick, and I understand that. But if you know you're going to bring Rinku Singh on, as soon as any bowler is bowled out, you should be bringing Rinku Singh on to pick an extreme example. Sarvesh says, and I think this is a big question for Indian cricket. If we don't see the impact sub coming in other places anyway, he says it hurts development, or does it hurt development of genuine all-rounders? Do you agree with that, Dan?
Well, I do. I would caveat that by saying that I don't think that there's that many genuine all-rounders in the world cricket. When I say genuine all-rounders, I'm thinking about players who bat in the top 6 and 7 at the very, very lowest, and bowl minimum 3 overs a game on average, so like 18 plus balls per match on average. They don't really exist. There's not many of them. There are a few. There's not many of them. What I do think it does constrain the usage of those type of players. It makes them less attractive in the marketplace, because you don't need bits and pieces players so much anymore. Whereas that did happen in the past. There were bits and pieces players who maybe weren't quite good enough to get in the team as a batter and not quite good enough to get in the team as a bowler. But the teams like the kind of the package, the flexibility that they bring, and the balance that they add to the team. We don't need that so much anymore with an impact sub. And also, I look at the national team and I think they don't have that many really good all-rounders, or even a lot of batters who can contribute, like even match-up spin. And I think that's really mandatory in a T20 tournament, for example. Otherwise, you've got to go with a kind of a 6+5, which makes it really difficult in terms of getting balance and batting depth. What I think that where England have maybe a little bit more had a bit more foresight and a bit more sort of encouragement of those multifaceted players. Like now, you're seeing a lot of batters who bowl. You see a lot of bowlers who can hit, and you see other batters who have actually tried to work really hard for a couple of years and incorporate wicket keeping into their armoury. And actually, because they know that that's going to get them deals in overseas leagues. Obviously, Indian players can't do that. So there's not that incentive to do that in terms of getting, franchise league contracts in another country. But they should still do it because it's going to affect their market value in the auction environment. And that can be the difference with, £500,000 or something like that in between going for 1 crore, going for 6 crore. Like that's a huge difference. And if you're multi-skilled, you're gonna be much more valuable in the marketplace. We've seen that so many times in recent auctions. Bowlers who can hit and batters who can have at least bowl some spin or something like that, and the rare sort of hen's teeth genuine all-rounders, they go for a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it is something that long term could hurt Indian cricket. Now that might be solved by just introducing the impact sub in international cricket, in which case, everything's golden, isn't it? But I'm not advocating. I always go for Krishnappa Gautam here, but Krishnappa Gautam didn't really play that many games in the IPL. But he's always the guy I think of not quite good enough to be a bowler, not quite good enough to be a batter, but still good enough to get into a team to balance them off slightly, batting seventh. Or Washington Sundar is probably a better example. Like okay defensive bowler, sometimes a good defensive bowler, and an okay batter, and maybe in the right circumstances he'll contribute. But now that you can have an impact sub and just pick a better bowler and a better batter, Washington Sundar is somewhat superfluous to requirements. You do in international cricket still need a few of these guys knocking around, I think. And your point, or I think the alternative is that you have some actual frontline batters that can bowl, and it's a quirk of Indian cricket. They don't produce tons. Tons. Yeah, I wonder. I mean, like again, this is a little bit of a tangent. I wonder if that's because you get a lot more spinners and a lot more spin bowled in Indian cricket. So in English domestic cricket, it's not uncommon to have an all-seam attack, and that means that if you get to day 4 in a first-class match, you might need somebody who can turn their arm over. And because everyone's coming up, because everyone's coming up through the same system where they're being taught some first-class skills, that's actually quite a useful thing to be able to do. Whereas in Indian cricket, your team's almost certainly got 1, if not 2, frontline spinners in it already, and that's. Therefore, they're just going to bowl. Why would you throw the ball to someone else if you've got a frontline spinner?
Going back to the 2 players that you mentioned as well, Washington Sundar. I mean, look. I mean, I think he was a real talent when he first broke through, and I'm actually quite disappointed with his career trajectory. I call him is like an extra depth player in terms of his batting. Because he's just a safety net. He's not attacking enough to bat in the top 7, but he gives depth in case of a collapse. But as you say, with the impact sub, that's not quite as valuable now as it used to be, and we're seeing maybe that has had an impact on his game time. And if I'm Washington Sundar or someone who's close to Washington Sundar and advising him, I would literally say to him, just work on your power hitting. Like, you're good enough to bowl, but you're an offie, so you're matching up against only 25% of batters because 75% of batters are right-handed. So you've got to have a really valuable second skill set, and that's going to have to be hitting. So I would say, just work on your hitting, work on your hitting, work on your hitting. And as for Krishnappa Gautam, I think your description of him was really accurate, but he still went, I think, for like 8 crore one time in an auction.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did.
Yeah. So again, that shows you
he's rich.
Yeah, he's done all right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no. Krishnappa Gautam's had a brilliant cricket career in terms of financial security and so on. Like, there's nothing wrong with what he's accomplished. He's just a little bit superfluous to requirements now. He was lucky to have been born just before the introduction. Well, on the right timeline. And Washington Sundar, I've just got his numbers up. He played 43 T20Is for India.
And now it's not
like, now he can't. He's not in the SRH side, and that's. So I think you're probably onto something, Sarvesh, there, but there are probably other factors at play as well. Man from the Hill says, how many more of these do you want to do, by the way? We'll just check in on.
How many you want to do? We're good.
Cool. All right. Man from the Hill says, has the value for we've actually done that one, so that was stupid of me. Podcast has gone off the rails. He says, could there be a case for utilising 5 overseas players in a tweak to the rules? Helps teams like SRH with 7 gun overseas players. So we're getting a little bit off analytics and what's actually happening and into a theoretical dimension with this now. What are your thoughts on that?
100%. I said it at the time. When the expansion took place, it had to happen. It has to happen because, and I'll go back to what I said previously about the dilution of talent and how that means that maybe like the 20 next best players are now playing regularly when they didn't when there was 8 teams. Now there's 10. And actually, if you increased it to 5 overseas per game, you're now getting 6 domestic players playing a game. Assuming we're taking impact subs out of the equation, we're getting six domestic players playing in a game. 10 teams are 60 domestic players. Before, when it was 4 overseas but 8 teams, we're getting 7 times 8, 56. So it's pretty much the same amount of domestic players now if there would be 5 overseas as there was previously when there's 4 overseas. So I definitely think that for balance purposes and to avoid dilution of talent, especially when you might think that there's further expansion in the league coming as well, maybe in the future, you've got to change the overseas player rule, definitely.
Yeah, I do think it's noticeably decreased the quality of the league. As a follow-on to that, off the top of my own head, I think we'd agreed in 2021 that the IPL was comfortably number 1 in terms of quality of cricket. Is it comfortably number 1 now, or is it not number 1 at all, or is it much more marginal with other leagues?
Good question. I think that the quality of the best teams in the IPL is incomparable to the quality of the best teams in other leagues. I think that the best teams in the IPL, if there was like a Champions League, would be comfortable favourites against the best teams in high quality overseas leagues. But I think that now the gap between the best and the worst teams in the IPL, which is kind of shouldn't happen because we're in a level budget league. You've got to be so bad to win less than 40% of your games over a decent sample size in terms of your strategy and your planning and stuff like that. You've got to be so bad to say over a 3-season period, if you're winning less than 40% of your games, that's horrendous in a level budget league. And we're finding now that there's a big gap between the best and the worst teams in the IPL. So I don't think that the gap between the best teams in the IPL and the best teams everywhere else has changed. But what I do think is that the best teams elsewhere would now compete pretty well against the bottom few teams in the IPL.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good summation. Like, I think RCB, not RCB. Oh, well, actually, RCB would struggle in a lot of leagues the way they're set up. I think Rajasthan Royals would sweep the decks if they did a world tour based on
what RCB have had with their bowlers. So not just in this game against Sunrisers today, but over the season, that bowling will get smashed in the blast. I've got no doubt about it. In a South group where the boundaries are not that big, you might have like the overseas players or the England players who, like a Topley might do okay, Lockie Ferguson might do okay, or and if he's having a good run, Siraj might do okay. But the rest of them will just get smashed like a domestic bowler in England would.
Yeah, they're not. They're just not inspirational. Well, they're so bad. Yeah. Last one, Dan. Is one impact sub pairing the way to go the way the CSK used their impact sub, where it's always a very similar substitution, or is being a bit more flexible like Rajasthan Royals preferable? What do you reckon on that one? Because I think if there is a tactical dimension to that, it's that more strategic question. Like, is it like we're always going to bring Rinku Singh off the bench, or would you rather it was a bit more variable and maybe Venkatesh Iyer and Ramandeep and someone else are on the bench?
Yeah, I would prefer there to be more of a tactical dimension to things, and the ability to outthink the opposition is always something that when I see new rules being implemented in leagues, I want there to be that ability. I think that there's not been enough of that in leagues over the years, and so it would be welcome if that was the impact sub rule was able to be a bit less formulaic. With the Rajasthan, I think that actually, I mean, obviously they're doing well this season. They have. I think in the last year or two, I think that there's probably fair to say that sometimes they've been a little bit too clever for their own good, or tried to be a little bit too clever for their own good. But I think actually you are starting to see them be quite smartly creative now. We saw in the last year or two the advent of our Ashwin as the pinch blocker, but which to a lot of casual fans probably doesn't make a lot of sense. But what it does make a lot of sense about is it then helps your other batters to play
Maximise
roles where they're maximised. Exactly, they can exhibit their super strengths a lot more. And in that situation, Ashwin is like a facilitator for the rest of the team. He's creating assists of boundaries basically, even though he might not even be batting at the time. And I think that's a really key point. Does that mean that Piyush Chawla should be batting above Tim David for MI? No, definitely not. But there are ways of being able to think about things in a little bit differently, and I think are a good example of that right now.
Yeah, fair enough. Dan, I think that's pretty much everything. The actual last point is, I guess, on the future of it. If you were going to improve the rule, you've said overseas players coming in as impact subs would name the team before the toss, so that there's a bigger tactical dimension to the decisions that you have to make in terms of that 11 and then the guys that are on the bench. And then the third question is, would you like to see it expanded out into other leagues, or are you happy with it being an IPL exclusive situation?
Okay, so 5 overseas.
Yeah.
Team in before the toss.
Yep.
And we've already got it in ILT 20, I think, already. And yes, I would like to see it in other leagues. I think it would be really good. The more scope that there is to outthink opposition, and the more scope that there is for talking points, can only be a good thing in cricket. And I think we see that here.
I think if you made those changes, I don't love it the way it is. I think it is. I don't know if I would say diminishes the game, but I think it makes the game quite formulaic. And I think I would rather not have the rule, and the jeopardy of the wicket is higher. I find that more dramatic as a taste thing. But I think if you made those changes, and I think particularly the introduction of the overseas one, I think it would be worth having, because you'd get more talking points, you'd get more stars playing in the. I mean, like, no offense to the 12th best Indian player at Gujarat Titans, but I don't care. Like it's or not the 12th best, it would be the 7th best, wouldn't it? Like it's not exciting me that we're getting to see that one extra player who is in often really used as a facilitator, so that Shimron Hetmyer or Tim David or whoever it is can bat with a slightly better matchup at the death. Like that's not
Swatia.
Yeah, it's not. It's
yeah,
it's not exciting me as a sports fan. But I think if you were bringing in whoever it is from whichever team that you want, like it Glenn Phillips for Sunrisers Hyderabad, I think that's making me watch the game.
Or Faruqi, like that, who can't get in because of balance overseas. Yeah.
It's a wild card thing, and I think that's the tweak that I would like. Anyway, Dan, we're going to wrap up there.
The Sunrisers thing. I mean, imagine if you could bring in Faruqi and not have an Adcat, for example. I mean, like that's a really good example, maybe, of the comparison that you're making. I mean,
or even like RCB. I mean, if they could play Will Jacks and Cameron Green, maybe they'd be slightly less crap. Or like I mean, they didn't play Glenn Maxwell today. I mean, like because of the overseas restriction, and there is a mechanism to have Glenn Maxwell come in with 3 a ball required over 8 overs, and that is in use in the league. But the actual way the rule plays out, or the way the rule's written, means that we don't get Glenn Maxwell, we get Anna Drawat, and it's just like that is not what I want as a cricket fan. I don't want to see Anna Drawat bat in a high leverage situation when at the other end we've got Dinesh Karthik playing one of the best ever pointless innings. Like, imagine if it was Glenn Maxwell instead of Anna Drawat. That could have been a classic, but it wasn't.
Yeah,
it wasn't. So to bookend the podcast with an absolutely crazy game of cricket, there's a point from me. But remember to like and subscribe to Strike Rate, the Cricket Analytics podcast. Get your reviews in as well. We've had a fair number on Spotify. We've had a couple on Apple too. So if you're an Apple user, that'd be really handy. And find me and Dan on Twitter. Dan is at SA Advantage, and I'm at Jack Hope 0. Goodbye, everyone.